How much time do I have?
You have 15 minutes.
Yeah, if you want to maybe hold it up at 10, and then that'll give me time to wind up, and I'll go to questions. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Josh McKoon. I'm running to be your next Secretary of State. I want to spend my time with you this morning telling you a little bit about who I am, where I came from, a little bit about why I'm running, what we hope to accomplish, and why I'm your best choice in the May 22nd Republican primary. My family moved to Columbus, Georgia because my great-grandfather had a job opportunity, and that was to work at the Eagle and Phoenix Textile Mill in downtown Columbus, right along the Chattahoochee River. My granddad dropped out, or my great-grandfather worked in the mill for 50 years. My grandfather dropped out of school in the 8th grade to help take care of our family during the Depression. He worked a lot of odd jobs until World War II broke out. He enlisted in the Army. He served in the Pacific Theater. Came back home after the war ended. He married my grandmother, who worked at commercial printers in Columbus. And in those years, he was a milkman. He was a railroad conductor. Eventually, they saved up enough money to open a little grocery store at 5th Avenue and 8th Street in downtown Columbus. That was the first of several small businesses they would have over the years. My earliest childhood memory is of refilling the Coca-Cola machine with my granddad at the laundromat they owned and operated, which was the last of those small businesses. My dad was the first member of our family to go to college. He went to Auburn University. He worked in that same Eagle and Phoenix mill in the summertime, earning tuition to go to college. He went on to law school and has been a practicing lawyer for 40 years, and I followed in his footsteps. I went to Furman University for my undergrad, and they tell you to get the bad information out up front, so I'm going to go ahead and tell you all I went to the University of Alabama for law school. And John Barrow, who is the likely Democratic nominee in this race, took notice of that on the night of the national championship game, called me out on Twitter and said, I hope everybody's pulling for Georgia, even Josh McKoon, who went to the University of Alabama. And I had to respond to him, and I said, I have been a lifelong Georgia Bulldogs fan, much to my father's chagrin. And I said to him, Congressman Barrow, I'm pulling for Georgia tonight, have been all my life, and I didn't even have to ask Nancy Pelosi permission. So I haven't heard from the congressman on Twitter since then. But I tell you all that just to give you a little sense of who I am, where I come from. My family's really been able to live our American dream, every generation doing a little bit better than the one that's come before. And what animated my interest in politics is that government, in my opinion, has gotten in the way of a lot of people being able to achieve their American dream. So why am I running for Secretary of State? I'm running to make Georgia the fastest state in the nation to get a job and the toughest state in the nation to cast an illegal vote. That's really what it boils down to. When we talk about the fastest state in the nation to get a job, we're really talking about licensing and licensing reform. Today, over 1 in 4 Americans have to get a permission slip from the government, a license to go to work. 40 years ago, it was fewer than 1 in 20 that had to get a license to go to work. I think we've had some overregulation. Sometimes public health and public safety, you need a license. But I think y'all would agree with me, if we stopped licensing librarians in this state tomorrow, there would not be a public health or public safety crisis. So there are really two questions that we need to ask. And the first one is this something that should require a permission slip from government to go do? And if it is, how do we connect people to the dignity of honest hard work faster, whether it's through apprenticeships or other creative ways of thinking? In our state, a cosmetology license holder, this is someone who has a license to cut and color hair and do nails, on average spends 350 days in training. An EMT license holder who's trained to give life-saving aid in the event of a medical emergency has 31 days of training on average. Now, you just can't tell me that it takes 10 times the training to learn to cut and color hair and do nails as it does to render life-saving aid in the event of a medical emergency. We got to roll that red tape out of the way and create job opportunities for people. And we can create more jobs than bringing Amazon to Georgia, and we don't have to give a big tax break. We don't have to change the law. We just have to get government out of the way and let people go after their dreams. I think that's what conservatives are all about. So that's the number one job, licensing reform. There's some resources that we need to gather, and that's why I've proposed a constitutional amendment so that licensing fees go to the licensing boards. That kind of makes sense. But right now, that money goes into a pot at the General Assembly, and the legislature spends it however they want. I want to give y'all the opportunity to dedicate that money so it goes to the purpose it's intended for. Nurses in our state, 170,000 licensed nurses in our state, There are 550 open complaints right now where a nurse could potentially lose their license. It is taking 400 days on average to investigate those complaints. That's 400 days that if that nurse really has a problem, is in the hospital working with patients. On the other hand, if it's not a meritorious complaint, it's 400 days, they got that hanging over their head. We got to address that, and we can do that by putting the money where it needs to go. On elections, very briefly, we're going to need new election technology. That election technology should have a paper element to it that is verifiable for voters. It should be an open process, a transparent process, where the local boards of elections are involved, because those are the folks actually running the election. You know, having a lawyer in this position, I am a lawyer. I tell people I have 2 strikes against me. I'm a lawyer and an elected official. But having a lawyer with an election law background is important. Secretary of State, you know, that used to be a sleepy position. But starting with Bush versus Gore and Katherine Harris down in Florida, it began to be a position that got sued over and over again. And that's happened in the last 8 years. We've been sued repeatedly over voter registration laws, over requiring us to print ballots in multiple foreign languages, even though to become a citizen of this country you have to demonstrate conversance in the English language. You need a lawyer in this position who can make the executive decision about when to fight this litigation, where the left is trying to sneak some of these policies in the back door. So that's very important. So why am I your best choice in the May 22nd Republican primary? I've consolidated a lot of support around the Republican Party. 21 of my fellow state senators, including our newly elected President Pro Tem Butch Miller from right here in Hall County, supporting my campaign. We've consolidated financial support around the state. We're #1, we just had the disclosures this past week. We're #1 in fundraising. We're #1 with money in the bank because we've been fiscally conservative with the resources folks have entrusted to us. So we've got a lot of momentum. But we need your help, because there are 2 things you need to ask yourself about this election. #1, who is the most qualified for the position? I've worked election law, I understand the licensing boards, I understand the corporations, and I'm willing to take the pressure that's going to come. In November of 2020, Donald Trump will be on the ballot for re-election. They spent $50 million trying to flip the Karen Handel-John Ossoff race and filed multiple lawsuits. Imagine what they're going to do when President Trump's on the ballot. You need somebody who's tested, and I've been tested over these last 8 years. You also need somebody who can prosecute the case against John Barrow. I'm ready to do that. I can communicate our message, and I can remind people about his vote for Speaker Pelosi and his 85% voting record with Barack Obama during his time in Congress. So I appreciate the time this morning. Again, my name is Josh McKoon. I'm running to be your next Secretary of State to make Georgia the fastest state in the nation to get a job and the toughest state in the nation to cast an illegal vote. And if I've got some time, I'd love to answer any questions that you might have. Yes, sir.
I don't have a question, but I just want to say thank you for your efforts to bring honesty and integrity to the people in the capital of Georgia.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate that. You know, we've thank you. We've worked very hard on that. You know, this is the first year the Senate is live streaming all of our committee meetings. In the 7 years I was in the Senate, that was not happening. And so last year, they told me it was going to be very expensive to live stream these meetings. So I said, well, I'm going to use a real expensive piece of equipment, my cell phone, and I started live streaming all the committee meetings. And thankfully, due to the leadership of our then President Pro Tem David Schaefer and others, we got the money in the budget, and this year, for the first time, you do not have to drive to downtown Atlanta to see what's happening at your state capitol. But thank you for your comment.
Still got time.
Any other? Yes, ma'am.
Now, can you tell us about the budget of the Secretary of State, how the process is to where you will have the funds allocated so you can change whatever voting type systems we're going to have?
Sure, that's a great question. So the Secretary of State's office is kind of unique in that it generates about $80 million in revenue for the state every year when you add in corporate filing fees and all the various licensure fees that are paid. Now, one of the problems is most of that money goes into the general fund, so it's up to the legislature to appropriate that money. The new voting machines, depending on what kind of model we adopt statewide, could be as low as 25 or 30 million, or it could be as high as 100 to 110 million. So that's going to be a decision the Secretary of State's office will make with the legislature, because they'll have to approve the funding. Once the funding's approved, then we'll put together a request for proposal and we'll go through the procurement process. The machine that a lot of people are talking about is a touchscreen machine that then produces a paper ballot that's pre-printed with your choices, you then put that into a scanner and it drops into a ballot box. So there's an electronic record of your vote, but there's also a physical copy in case there's a need for a recount or something. That's the more expensive technology. The other way to go on the other end of the spectrum would be just a paper-based system totally that you put in a scanner and allow it to drop in a box. Yes, sir.
I would like to know your opinion on Amazon coming, because it does seem like some of our leadership is trying to shape legislation based on whether or not Amazon is okay with it. And, you know, obviously they are a more left-leaning company, and we all use Amazon. I'm for it, and I'm for all the jobs that it would bring. But I'm not for changing our belief system just to get them to come here. And I'm not sure if that's necessarily what they're doing, but it seems like it sometimes. And it would also change the infrastructure of Atlanta, traffic and all that stuff. I'd just like to know your opinion on it.
Yeah, so the Amazon deal, you know, there are really three things that I think companies look at when they're making these decisions. They look at the available infrastructure and workforce. They look at the tax and regulatory policy. And frankly, they want to know how big of an economic incentive package the state's willing to come to the table with. My feeling about it is, you know, we've got to evaluate these things on a case-by-case basis, and I don't, because of our secrecy laws, I have no idea what the incentive package is. So it's hard for me to give you a straight answer on that. What I will say is that I think we need to be mindful of Georgia companies that have grown here. You know, the example I like to think about is Home Depot. You know, nobody wrote Home Depot a huge check. You know, they just invested in our state and invested in our people. So I think we got to be real cautious about what kind of economic incentives we put on the table. I understand that's always a part of the discussion. But until we frankly know what's on the table, it's really hard to answer your question.
You got 3 minutes.
Okay, well, if there's other questions, I'll answer them. If not, I'll take my 3 minutes. Yes, sir.
What's been your most proud moment in the Senate?
The thing I'm the most proud of my time in the legislature is the passage of ethics reform at the General Assembly. When I was elected, I ran on the fact that Georgia was one of 3 states in the nation that had no limitation on gifts from lobbyists to members of the Georgia General Assembly. We were seeing about $2 million a year spent on legislators by lobbyists. In 2013, after many years of trying, we were able to get a $75 cap passed, which I believe has dramatically changed the culture at the Capitol in a favorable way. I think it's improved public confidence. I think those measures are really, really important. And that's the kind of attitude I'm going to take to the Secretary of State's office. One of the initiatives I want to push forward is something called the online checkbook. Ohio has this. It tracks all state spending down to a check register level. If you Google Ohio checkbook when you go home, you'll see what I'm talking about. But think about this, the idea that $26 billion, that's just sort of this abstract number to us, being able to track down to the penny where your tax dollars are going. It's a great tool for legislators, frankly, as they write the budget, but it's also great for you and your community to see where that money's going. But the ethics reform would probably be my number one good feeling out of my legislative service.
I've got one quick one for you.
Yes, sir.
What is your, and this is kind of an opening question, I guess, but what is your opinion on the importance of local parties?
I'm so glad you asked that question. So I was chairman of my county party before I ran for the state senate. And the local parties are frankly the backbone of a successful united campaign. I think a lot of people have made that, we've gotten a little resting on our laurels a little bit and saying, well, everything's in the Republican primary, you know. November 2018, we are going to be in a dogfight, ladies and gentlemen. And so having active county parties that are building up right now, it's incredibly important because our whole ticket's going to have to really lean on the parties, particularly the Secretary of State's race. Because I'm telling y'all, George Soros has a project to flip these Secretary of State's offices around the country. Millions of dollars from New York and Los Angeles are going to flow into this state on a lot of the races, but particularly the Secretary of State's race. And so having that grassroots organization of being able to reach out to the folks in your community is critically important for us in November.
40 seconds.
Okay, well, with my 40 seconds, I'll just say this. On April 30th, early voting starts. May 22nd is Election Day. I need your vote. Josh McKoon. Matt Fuentes is in the back of the room. If you'll wave at everybody, Matt, so they see you. We need you to sign up with our campaign. These down ticket races, very few people know what the office is, much less the people who are running. The most valuable thing you can give to us is your personal endorsement, and reach out to your friends and family, people you go to church with, people you work with, and say, I met Josh McKoon on a Saturday morning. He seems like a great guy. You need to vote for him when you're voting for whoever your candidate is for governor. So that's what I would ask you for. Thank you so much for your time and attention this morning. I'll be hanging around later if you got any other questions. Thanks again.